The first time I learned that my wife's ex still loved her was at a business dinner. That night, the man held my hand and said to me, "Daniel, do you know? If I hadn't left 10 years ago, she might not be your wife today." I smiled, because he was right. But what he didn't know was, 10 years ago he lost Nora, and 7 years ago, I won the reason she chose me. My name is Daniel, founder of Northbridge Technologies. I am 35 years old, have been an entrepreneur for 7 years, and am married. Nora and I have been married for 7 years. Over those 7 years, we have been through a lot. Failed startups, financial pressure, and the loss of loved ones. At the lowest point of our lives, we slept in a small apartment with only a bed. But those 7 years also convinced me that this woman is the one I want to spend my life with. She is not the perfect heroine from a movie. She gets irritable because of work stress, forgets to buy milk, and gets angry because I leave my socks lying around. But she also silently brews a cup of coffee when I'm still revising a proposal at 3 in the morning, gets more excited than I do when I secure my first round of funding, and stands by my side when everyone thinks my startup has failed, telling me, "Daniel, you just haven't succeeded yet." The first time I met her was in a hospital corridor. That day, I was visiting a friend who was hospitalized. She was sitting on a bench waiting for test results, holding a novel she was halfway through. I walked over to talk to her. She looked up at me, then went back to reading her book. I later asked her why she ignored me back then, and she said, "Because the book was more interesting than you." I asked why she paid attention to me later then, and she said, "Because you stood there and wouldn't leave," and I thought, how can this person be so stubborn? When we got married later, she said at the wedding, "When I first met Daniel, I thought he was the worst person I'd ever seen at trying to pick someone up." The whole room laughed. Then she said, "But he's also the most persistent person I've ever met." So, I never doubted that she loved me, until that dinner party. The dinner was a university reunion, and also Samuel's first public appearance since returning to the country. To be honest, if Nora hadn't told me in advance, I wouldn't even have known who he was. "I might run into an old friend tonight," she said as she drove, her tone flat. "Who?" I asked. She gripped the steering wheel and paused for a second. "Samuel." I had heard that name before. Not because of him, but because years ago a friend told me Nora had an excellent boyfriend during college. I smiled and asked what happened next, and my friend said he went abroad. I didn't ask any further, because I believe everyone has a past. But that night, when Samuel walked toward me through the crowd, extended his hand, and said those words, I realized believing and being ready are two different things. When Samuel appeared, the entire hall fell silent for a moment. He was indeed exceptional. 34 years old, founder of an overseas tech company, wearing a simple yet expensive suit, speaking unhurriedly, and carrying a confidence born of long-term success. Many people gathered around to exchange pleasantries. He responded with a smile, then his gaze cut through the crowd and landed on Nora. I noticed, not out of jealousy, but because that look was too obvious. Like someone finally finding something lost for a very long time. "Nora," he said. She looked at him and replied calmly, "Samuel." No excitement, no surprise, not even a hug to mark a reunion after a long separation. I breathed a sigh of relief. But the next second, someone raised a glass to welcome him back, and everyone stood up, yet Nora didn't move. She sat there, looking at the wine glass on the table. I gently nudged her. "Everyone is waiting." Only then did she pick up her glass. Samuel saw it. His expression showed a moment of disappointment, but he quickly regained his smile. "Thank you, everyone. This time, I won't be leaving again." Applause broke out, and then someone asked with a smile if he planned to settle down here. Samuel smiled and said, "Some things I've been away from for too long." As he said this, he looked at Nora. Everyone understood. I understood too. But to my surprise, Nora didn't avoid it. She spoke up directly. "Samuel, there's no need to bring up the past." The air instantly froze. Samuel paused for a moment, then smiled. "You're still the same as before, direct." Nora didn't respond. At that moment, for the first time, I realized that the story between them might be more complicated than I had imagined. Halfway through the dinner, when I went to get some wine, I saw Samuel and Nora talking on the terrace from a distance. They were standing not too close, not too far, Samuel's hand resting on the railing, Nora with her arms crossed. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw the expression on Nora's face. It wasn't intimate or nostalgic, but a kind of seriousness, as if she were listening to someone very important explain something. That image lingered in my mind for a long time, not because of jealousy, but because at that moment I realized I knew too little about Nora's past. The car was quiet on the way home. I wasn't angry, and I didn't question her. I simply asked if she was okay. Nora looked out the window and said, "I don't know." This answer took me by surprise. She sighed. I thought that after 10 years, seeing him again, I would feel nothing. But when we actually met, I realized that some memories were still there. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, but I didn't interrupt her. She continued, "It's not love, just memory. A person who once existed." I asked her if she still loved him. This was the first time I asked this question directly. I wouldn't have before because I felt that mature people shouldn't ask about the past. But tonight I wanted to know the answer. Nora was silent for a few seconds and said, "Daniel, I can't lie to you. When I was 20, I did love him." The car fell silent. If I had heard those words in the past, I might have been hurt, but now I just asked, "And now?" She turned to look at me. "Now, the one I love is you." This sentence was simple. Yet for some reason, I listened even more intently, because she didn't deny the past. Nor did she try to comfort me with a line like, "I never loved him." She chose honesty. Back home, she sat down beside me and said she wanted to talk. I nodded and asked if it was about Samuel. She said it was about me. That night, for the first time, she told me the story of her and Samuel. 10 years ago, Nora was 20, and back then she believed that love could solve everything. Samuel was the most outstanding person at school. Smart, ambitious, and with a bright future. They had planned their future together. He said that once he graduated, they would go to a bigger city together, and she believed him. Until one day Samuel told her he was going abroad. She asked how long, and he said he didn't know. She felt afraid for the first time and asked, "What about us?" Samuel fell silent, then said to wait for him to return successfully. In that moment he thought it was a promise, but what Nora heard was, "Wait until I'm ready for you to decide." Later he left and she didn't wait, not because she didn't love him, but because she understood that love cannot rely on just one person waiting. After saying all this, Nora looked at me. "Do you feel like you're just someone who came later?" I didn't answer because she had hit the mark. She held my hand. "Daniel, do you know the difference between you and him? He made me believe the future would be good, while you stayed with me through the time when the future hadn't gotten good yet." In that moment I wasn't moved. I just suddenly realized, what truly made me uneasy wasn't Samuel's return, but that I had never realized I was actually afraid I wasn't worthy enough. The next morning I went to the office. Jack was already there. Jack is my co-founder and my best friend from college. During the company's toughest times, he slept in the office with me, we ate instant noodles together, and we faced investor rejections together. Once, when the company account was frozen, he used his own savings to help me pay employee salaries. I have always believed that if there is anyone in this world who would not betray me, that person is Jack. "How was last night?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee. "It was okay." He glanced at me. "You don't look okay." I smiled. "I met Nora's ex at the dinner party." Jack raised an eyebrow. "The one who went abroad? He's back." And then, I thought for a moment. He said he's staying. Jack fell silent for a few seconds, then patted me on the shoulder. "Bro, you're the most steady person I've ever met. Don't overthink it." I nodded. At that time, I had absolutely no idea that a few months later, the person who would hurt me the most would be this very man I considered a brother. 3 days later, the company received an invitation from Samuel's company. The content consisted of only one sentence. We hope to collaborate with Northbridge Technologies. I looked at that email, and a premonition arose in my heart. This reunion would not stop at emotions. Because some competitions are never about winning a woman, but about two men proving their life choices. From a business perspective, this invitation came out of nowhere. Although Northbridge has developed well in recent years, it is simply not on the same scale as the international group founded by Samuel. His company possesses overseas markets, vast capital, and a mature team. Under normal circumstances, an entrepreneur like him wouldn't actively seek a partnership with us unless he had an ulterior motive. A week later, I met Samuel in the company conference room. This time, there was no banquet, no classmates, no emotions from the past, just two business people. He sat across from me, looking at the company's development timeline on the wall, and said, "You've built a great company." I smiled slightly. "Thank you." "To be honest," he said, "when I first returned to the country, I didn't expect you could achieve this level." The remark sounded like a compliment but also like a probe. I leaned back in my chair. "Do you think I just got lucky?" Samuel paused, then smiled. "You're more direct than I imagined." "I just want to know," I said. "Why did you seek me out?" He was silent for a moment, then replied, "Because of your technology." He looked at me and paused. "Of course, there is another reason." Just as expected. "Nora." The meeting room fell silent for a second. I didn't evade the question. "Does she know you approached me for a collaboration?" "I know." "What did she say?" Samuel looked at me. "She said if the collaboration is for the sake of the career, she supports it. If it's because of the past, she won't accept it." I smiled. That answer was very like Nora. She would never make decisions for others, but she wouldn't allow anyone to take advantage of her feelings either. "So, what did you actually come here for today?" I asked. Samuel looked out the window. "Daniel, do you know what I'm most unwilling to accept?" I didn't answer. "It's not about losing Nora," he continued. "It's that I spent 10 years proving myself, only to find that the person she chose didn't need to prove anything." That statement left me silent, because for the first time, I saw this man's true emotion. Not pride, not possessiveness, but unwillingness. After the collaboration officially began, I had more and more contact with Samuel. To be fair, he is indeed strong. His judgment, execution, and international experience are all things I lack. But at the same time, he also recognized my strengths. I understand users better, know more about teams, and am more willing to listen to different voices. We are like two people who grew up in completely different directions, yet we found our respective places in the same project. After one meeting, it was already very late when Samuel suddenly asked, "Want to grab a meal together?" I hesitated for a moment, then agreed. We found a very ordinary roadside stall. He sat on a plastic stool in his bespoke suit, a rather comical sight. "You know," he twirled some noodles with his chopsticks, "I used to think that if I became more successful than you, Nora would look at me again." I looked at him, and now, he smiled. "Now I realize that she stopped needing someone to prove his success a long time ago. What she needs is someone willing to live life with her." I silently ate my noodles, saying nothing. However, Samuel put down his chopsticks. "There is something I've always wanted to ask you." "What?" "When you proposed to her 7 years ago, did you know about my existence?" I thought for a moment. "I know a little. Do you mind?" "I used to," I said honestly. "But later I realized something." "What?" "When she chose to be with me, she was already herself. She didn't come to me carrying any regrets about you. She simply met me, and then decided to stay." Samuel looked at me for a long time, then raised his cup. "To you." "To what?" "To telling the truth." I raised my cup and clinked his. After that night, my wariness toward Samuel eased a little. But I didn't know that the real test hadn't even started yet. Over the next month, the partnership entered a critical phase. The core project began to move forward, with both teams jointly developing a new technology. Samuel's team brought overseas resources, while our team provided local market insights. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, until that weekend. That day, Nora said she was going to meet a friend from college to discuss an old project. I didn't think much of it and let her go. In the afternoon, when I passed by that cafe, I saw them through the glass. Samuel and Nora sitting together, with an open laptop and several documents on the table. Samuel was saying something, and Nora was listening intently, nodding occasionally. Their distance was neither too close nor too far, but Samuel would occasionally point at the screen, leaning toward Nora's side. I stood across the street and watched for a while. No hugs, no ambiguity, not even a smile. But that scene stung, not because I suspected anything, but because it was a past I could never be part of. What they were discussing happened 10 years ago, back when Nora didn't know me yet, and Samuel was still the most important person in her world. I didn't walk over. I turned around and went back to the office. That evening, when Nora came home and saw me working on documents on the sofa, she casually said, "I ran into a friend today, and we chatted about old times." "What old matter?" She glanced at me. "An old project from Samuel's father's company. We studied it back then before he went abroad, but it was later shelved. He wants to restart it now that he's back, and asked for my opinion." "What opinion did you give him?" "I told him that there's no point in doing that project anymore. The market has changed." She sat down next to me. "Why?" "Nothing," I said. She stared at me for a few seconds, then said, "Daniel, did you see me?" I paused for a moment, then nodded. "Then why didn't you come in?" "Because that is your business." She fell silent for a moment, then said, "You're wrong." "What?" "That's all in the past." She took my hand. I was talking to him about work, but sitting there for an hour, all I could think was, if it were you across from me, I would have spoken more freely. I didn't say anything, but the thorn in my heart eased a little. The following week, during a project meeting, Samuel suddenly proposed an idea, adjusting the technical roadmap. His plan was bolder, but the risks were also higher. Our team was divided, with Jack opposing it in particular. "This direction is too aggressive," Jack said during the meeting. "If it fails, all our previous efforts will be wasted." Samuel glanced at him. "High risk, high reward. If you only look at the risk, you'll always be second." The meeting room fell silent. Jack didn't look pleased. I stepped in to mediate. "Both proposals have their pros and cons. Let's give it another week for evaluation." After the meeting, Jack came to find me. "Do you trust him?" "I trust the data." Jack stared at me. "Daniel, he is your wife's ex. Do you know what the whole company is saying?" "Saying what?" "You sold the company to a romantic rival." I looked at him. "Do you know why I trust him? It's not because of his relationship with Nora, but because his proposal actually makes sense. If you think it's wrong, use data to convince me." Jack fell silent, then turned and walked out. Watching his retreating figure, I suddenly felt a sense of unfamiliarity. That was the first time I felt that something between Jack and me was changing. But I didn't dwell on it. I thought it was just work pressure. Later I found out that during that time, Jack had already been in contact with our competitors. The real trouble broke out 3 weeks later. That morning, as soon as I arrived at the company, I sensed that something was off. The core members of the project team were standing at the conference room door, with grave expressions. David, a board member, walked over and handed me a report. "Our core data has been leaked." I opened the report, and the more I read, the heavier my heart became. The technical direction released by a competitor a week ago highly overlapped with our R&D roadmap. It could almost be described as a copy. This meant that the R&D achievements of the past 3 years might have been prematurely replicated, and if not handled properly, the company would suffer heavy losses. "How did it leak?" I asked. "Internal," David said. "No more than 10 people have access to the core data." Everyone in the conference room looked at me. Then their eyes simultaneously shifted to another person, Samuel. Because everyone knew he was the one who had just joined the partnership and was the most capable of accessing the core data. More importantly, if Northbridge failed, his company would be one of the biggest beneficiaries. "Daniel," David spoke up, "we have to investigate. If he is the leaker, I interrupted him. Until the investigation results are out, anyone could be a suspect. But, another supervisor said, you have a personal relationship with him, which will affect your judgment. I looked at him. That is exactly why I need evidence even more. After the meeting, Samuel found me and stood at the office door. You know, I thought you would be the first to suspect me. I looked at him. I do have my suspicions. He froze. I continued. But suspicion and conviction are two different things. This rendered him silent. After a long while, he smiled. No wonder she chose you. I frowned. What do you mean? Because you don't make decisions based on emotions. I didn't respond, but I knew deep down. This time, I wasn't trying to prove I was better than him. I wanted to become a better version of myself. Not a better businessman, but a better person. The investigation lasted 3 days. That afternoon, when the results came out, the investigator in charge placed the name on my desk. I opened it and froze in my tracks. Jack, my co-founder, my best friend from college, the one who slept in the office with me, ate instant noodles, and faced countless rejections from investors. Are you sure? All the evidence points to him. Fund flows, email records, time of contact, it all matches. I sat in the office for a long time without moving. The city outside the window was still bustling, and everyone in the building was going about their own business. Yet suddenly, I felt as though I were standing in a completely unfamiliar place. That night, I contacted Jack. We chose to meet at the old office where we first started our business. It has now been abandoned, but the graffiti from those years still remains on the walls. The two of us sat on the dust-covered floor, just like many years ago. Jack saw me and didn't try to avoid it. He just lowered his head. You know, I looked at him. Why? He remained silent for a long time, then gave a bitter smile. Because I'm jealous of you. I froze. What? Do you know what the most ridiculous part is? He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. Everyone sees you succeed, sees you become the company founder, sees Nora choose you. But no one sees I also wanted to be you. I accompanied you in starting the business. I helped you through the hardships. But in the end, all the glory is yours. As he said these words, the pain in his eyes wasn't simple greed, but a long-accumulated sense of grievance. Do you remember the 3rd year? He suddenly said. That year we got our first investment, and the investor spoke only to you the entire time. I sat there for 40 minutes, and when we left, he shook my hand and said, You're Daniel's colleague, right? Thanks for your hard work. Colleague. When the two of us were sleeping in the same office, he called me a colleague. I closed my eyes, my heart heavy with mixed emotions. Anger, disappointment, and an indescribable sorrow. Someone paid me, Jack said. I thought it was just a transaction. I didn't mean for things to turn out like this. I looked at him. Jack, do you know what you've destroyed? He lowered his head. I know. It's not the company, I said. It's the trust between us. Jack didn't speak. He sat in that office where we once dreamed together, head bowed, like a statue crumbling apart. It was very late when I got home that night. Nora was waiting for me in the living room. Cold food sat on the table. Are you okay? She asked. I told her what happened. She remained silent for a long time after listening, then said, What do you plan to do? Handle it according to the law. What about Jack? He has to go. Nora nodded and didn't say much else. She walked over and sat down beside me. Daniel, do you know what the hardest part of all this is? What? You didn't just lose a partner. You lost a friend. She took my hand. You can hate him, but don't hate yourself for it. I looked at her. You don't think I should hate him? You should hate what he did, she said. But you also need to accept that you trusted him once, and that wasn't your fault. I didn't speak, but I held her hand a little tighter. The next day, according to the contract, Samuel could have completely withdrawn from the partnership due to this leak, and could have even taken the opportunity to buy out our shares. Many people thought he would definitely do so, because this is the business world. Opportunities do not wait for others. But he didn't. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Samuel held an impromptu press conference. I received the news while I was processing Jack's resignation procedures, and I opened the live stream to see him standing in front of the camera. I thought he would announce his withdrawal of investment. After all, that was the most reasonable business decision. But what he said was, "Northbridge Technologies remains an independent company, and our partnership continues." The news sent shockwaves through the entire industry. Reporters pressed him on the spot. "Mr. Samuel, why did you choose to help a competitor?" He paused for a moment, then answered, "Because I spent 10 years proving I was a winner. But then I realized that a true winner isn't someone who climbs over others, but someone who still knows what is right when others fall." I stared at the screen for a long time without speaking. That evening, Samuel came to my house. He stood at the door, holding a bottle of whiskey. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" I let him in. When Nora saw him in the living room, she paused for a moment, then said, "You two talk. I'll go make some tea." Samuel and I sat in the living room. He poured himself a glass of wine and said, "Do you know why I did that today?" "Why?" "Because 10 years ago, I made a mistake." He looked at his glass. "When I left, I thought that as long as I succeeded, everything would come back. Career, love, dignity, they would all come back. But later I realized that some things, once missed, are missed forever. You can spend 10 years becoming a better businessman, but the people you hurt won't forgive you just because of your success." I looked at him. "Do you think you hurt Nora?" "I know," he said, "because I didn't tell her the whole truth." I frowned. "What truth?" Samuel remained silent for a long time, then took an envelope out of his pocket and placed it on the table. "This, let her see it for herself, if she wants to." He stood up and walked to the door, looking back at me. "Daniel, I used to think we were rivals, but now I realize we just took two different paths, and each learned what we were meant to learn." After he left, I sat on the sofa holding that envelope. Nora came out with tea, saw the envelope, and asked what it was. "Left by Samuel," I said. "He said it was something he didn't tell you 10 years ago." Nora held the envelope and looked at it for a long time. She didn't open it immediately. She didn't look at it that night. The envelope sat on the nightstand, quiet as a dormant seed. When I woke up the next morning, she was already sitting by the window, having opened it. There were only 3 pages in the letter. The very first sentence made her hand stop. "Nora, if I had told you the truth back then, maybe we wouldn't have missed each other." I walked over and sat down beside her, not looking at the letter, just keeping her company. She slowly read through the entire letter, and then remained silent for a long time. The letter stated, 10 years ago, Samuel decided to go abroad. Everyone thought he was pursuing greater success, including Nora. But in reality, things weren't that simple. At the time, Samuel's father's company was in crisis, and the family business faced bankruptcy. If he didn't go abroad to take over the overseas operations, the entire family might lose everything. That year, Samuel had just graduated, and he faced 2 choices: stay and be with Nora, or leave and save the family. He chose the latter. But the problem was, he didn't tell Nora the whole truth, because his father told him, "If you tell her, she will stay for you. But then you will always feel that she sacrificed herself." So he chose silence. He said, "Wait for me to return victorious," thinking this was how he protected her. But he didn't know that for Nora, the most hurtful thing was not the leaving, but not being chosen. After reading the letter, she remained silent for a long time. I asked her softly, "Are you sad?" She shook her head. "No, it's just that." I realized that when we were young, we both thought we were protecting each other, but we ended up hurting one another. That really struck a chord with me, because many relationship problems aren't due to a lack of love, but rather an inability to express it. "Do you regret it?" I asked. She looked out the window. "I might have before. Not now." She turned to look at me. "Because if it weren't for that experience, I wouldn't have met you." I didn't speak, but I felt a very complicated emotion in my heart. Not a sense of victory, but a sense of relief. A few days later, I met up with Samuel. In a very quiet tea house, He sat across from me, dressed in ordinary clothes, looking much more relaxed than he had on the day of the dinner. "Did she see it?" he asked. I nodded. "Thank you for your letter." He gave a bitter smile. "I just felt she deserved to know the truth." We sat there for a long time, for the first time not as rivals but as two men talking about life. "You know," Samuel said, "I've had a question all these years. If I had stayed back then, would things have turned out differently? Is there an answer now?" He smiled. "No, because there are no what-ifs in life. But now I know the biggest mistake back then wasn't leaving, but believing that as long as I succeeded in the future, everything I lost would return. But some things, once the moment has passed, can only be accepted as part of the past." I looked at him and suddenly understood this man. He didn't lose to me, he just lost to time. The day before Samuel left, our college classmates organized another small gathering. Many people came, including some who knew their story from back then. Someone half-jokingly asked Nora, "If Samuel hadn't left back then, do you think you'd be with him now?" The air fell silent for a moment. This was a question on many people's minds, including mine. Nora didn't dodge it. She set down her glass and answered earnestly, "I don't know how the me of 10 years ago would have chosen, because back then, I didn't understand what real life was. But now," she took my hand, "I know that love isn't about finding the most outstanding person, but finding the one who is willing to face ordinary days with you. Samuel was once an important person in my life. I won't deny that. But an important person doesn't have to become a partner. My husband isn't with me because he won against others, but because he never made me feel that I needed to be someone else." I looked down at her holding my hand and suddenly realized, the woman who chose me 7 years ago never did so because I defeated anyone. She simply saw me. After the party, Samuel found me. "I'm leaving." "Where to?" "Europe. A fresh start." I laughed. "Give up here." He shook his head. "It's not giving up, it's accepting." He glanced at Nora in the distance, then said, "Thank you." I was a bit surprised. "What are you thanking me for?" "Thank you for proving that her choice back then was not wrong." I remained silent. He reached out his hand. "Daniel, you won." I didn't take it immediately, but asked him, "Do you really think this is about winning or losing?" He froze. I said, "If you hadn't left 10 years ago, perhaps the person standing by her side today would be you." He smiled. "But life has no ifs. So, I wish you happiness." We shook hands. In that moment, I knew what was truly ending wasn't a competition, but a chapter of the past. Before leaving, Samuel did something no one expected. He licensed one of his key patent technologies to Northbridge Technologies on extremely favorable terms, accompanied by a framework for deep strategic cooperation. The board was shocked. No one understood. Why would a businessman hand such a crucial bargaining chip to a former rival? And I received an email. From Samuel, the content consisted of just one sentence. "Daniel, some victories are not won by defeating others, but by making former opponents willing to believe in you." I looked at it for a long time, then turned off the screen. 6 months later, I went to Europe to attend a tech summit. Samuel was there too. We gave a joint interview. The reporter asked, "How do you view your relationship with each other?" Samuel spoke first. "I used to think winning and losing mattered, but later I realized it didn't." I added, "Because life isn't a competition." After the interview, we stood outside the venue. He handed me a cigarette. He had quit smoking for many years, but that day he made an exception and lit one. "You know," he said, "I used to envy you because the way Nora looked at you wasn't adoration, it was peace of mind." I looked at him. "Do you still envy it now?" He stubbed out his cigarette and smiled. "I don't envy it anymore. It's just that, when I left back then, I didn't actually figure out what I wanted." Upon returning from Europe, Nora came to pick me up at the airport. On the way, she said she recently watched a documentary about a family dealing with Alzheimer's. The husband introduces himself to his wife anew every day. "What would you do if one day I didn't remember anything?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "Then I just introduce myself every day." After all, you didn't remember me the first time we met either. She smiled, then stayed quiet for a long time. When we got home, she suddenly said, Daniel, sometimes I feel like we never need to reintroduce ourselves. I said, because we never truly parted. 3 years later, the company got on track. I went to a university to give a speech. The audience was filled with young people in their early 20s. Someone asked me, what is the greatest luck in life? I thought for a moment and said, it's not succeeding in a startup. It's having someone who didn't walk away when I doubted myself the most. After saying that, I saw Nora sitting in the corner. She said she just happened to be passing by, but she was holding the water bottle I had left at home. When we got home that night, she asked how the speech went, and I said it was okay. She asked, so what was the best part? I thought for a moment. It was that you were there when I came back. Years later, many years passed. The college classmates gathered again. Someone brought up the events of those years and jokingly asked Nora, if you could go back to being 20, would you make a different choice? Holding her cup, she didn't even think about it. No, because when I was 20, I chose love, only to find out later that love can leave too. But I chose him. She glanced at me. I chose the kind that doesn't leave. Someone nearby started teasing, saying it was too cheesy. She said, just the truth. On the way home, I said to her, what you said today was very short. She said nonsense is naturally short. It's not a speech. I said that in the past you would always say a long string at parties, leaving people completely stunned. She glared at me. That was what I used to think needed explaining. Later I realized that the truth doesn't need explaining. You just have to say it to the right person. I held her hand and said nothing more. Outside the window, the street lamps passed one by one. Suddenly I remembered that day in the hospital corridor, when she looked up at me, then lowered her head to turn a page of her book. Back then I didn't know who she was at all, nor did I know that we would spend so many nights together. But perhaps some things are just like that, you don't need to understand them in advance. You'll know when the time comes.